Welcome back to another LEO radio podcast. My name is Jim Harris, and I'm here with a lot of instructors today doing a leadership series. Why don't you guys introduce yourself before we kick it off?
Joey Spralaza, instructor with J. Harris Academy of Police Training.
Jason Felsing, also an instructor with J. Harris Academy of Police Training.
I'm Colin Congleton with J. Harris.
And Colin, since we ended with you, why don't we start with you? Why don't you kick it off? Tell us a little bit about the book we're going to be looking at and a little bit of background.
Sure. So, as Joey said, we're getting into a series on leadership here, and we thought a good place to start for that was a book by Jocko, Willink, and Leif Babin called Extreme Ownership. These two gentlemen were commissioned officers in the SEAL teams, combat veterans. They led Navy SEALs in combat in Iraq, and they put this book together to outline some of the fundamental leadership principles that help them to be successful leaders in combat. And then through the book, they relate those principles to people who are not necessarily in the military, primarily business, but there's a lot of stuff in here that's very, very useful for leaders in any capacity, in any profession. So we're gonna do a deep dive into that. And then we were discussing before the start, I thought it was valuable to include in there for our veteran listeners that Jocko was actually a Mustang as well. So he was a prior enlisted SEAL before he got his commission as an officer in the teams. A lot of us who have served find that experience to be very, very valuable. Having experienced life on both sides, the non-commissioned and commissioned side, gives guys a lot of valuable perspective. So,
And one of the things I want to hit upon with what you talked about is any leader, because in law enforcement, when we typically talk about the term leadership, you're thinking about command staff, first line supervisors, mid-level managers, your lieutenants or captains, majors, whatever it may be. But in law enforcement, and actually throughout the country, we are not just looking at the formal leaders in an organization. Every single member of our organization is a leader. In law enforcement, we don't want a bunch of followers. We want a bunch of leaders within our organization, somebody who's going to see something and take charge and take action in the moment. You can't always wait for a formal leader to step onto a scene to handle it. So I love the fact that you said about Colin, because it's so true that it's about all leaders at every rank, every level of the organization.
right. And one of the things that I really love about this book too is listeners will see as we get into the breakdown here, there's a lot of practical tips for leading up and down the chain of command. So whatever position you find yourself in, whether you're a brand new cop or a seasoned vet on the tour, but you don't have formal rank, all the way up to the chief. But it's also I find to be a great book for helping you to lead in your own life as well. And I think that's an important concept for people who are striving to be genuine leaders. So, it's not just applicable at work. It's helping you to be a leader, starting with yourself, leading yourself in the right direction, but being a leader for your family, for any organization that you're a part of, including your profession.
One of the things that hits home and resonates with me too is for these officers, especially as they gather experience and they improve in their own careers, the more that they're able to bring solutions to the table rather than just problems, that's such a level of emotional growth, professional growth. And this book hits on that too, right? And like what you're talking about, managing up and leading up, when you're bringing to your command staff and bringing to the people that are your superiors solutions to problems that you found, it helps with, number one, you're giving input. It's enlarging your personal career. It's enlarging your experience with your career. And it's helping them to actually come up with a solution. And especially if you're the boots on the ground, and I know Jocko goes into that a lot, right? With you have to have your ear to the ground, and who knows what's happening on the ground better than those frontline officers, those frontline supervisors. So if you're that frontline supervisor or that frontline officer and you see a problem and you see a solution, don't be afraid to bring that forward. Those are the people that should be bringing that forward, because they have the best insight into how to solve those types of problems.
One other thing I would just throw out, just to so that listeners have an idea of how we're going to approach this and break it down. The book is divided into parts, and then within each part there's chapters. So we're gonna work kind of chapter by chapter, and each chapter has a broad overarching theme, like extreme ownership, or chapter 2, no bad teams, only bad leaders. And then within those chapters there are principles, and we've selected some quotes directly from the book that illustrate the principles. So the discussion is largely going to be about the principles. Part 1, winning the war within. Chapter 1 is extreme ownership. What is that? Obviously it's the title of the book, but what does he mean by that? So the first principle on there: on any team, in any organization, all responsibility for success and failure rests with the leader. The leader must own everything in his or her world. There is no one else to blame. The leader must acknowledge mistakes and admit failures, take ownership of them, and develop a plan to win. What do you think of that?
I'll tell you what, that it's a strong statement, as you could imagine, but I think the biggest thing you have to take from it, and again, I'm a new-ish leader, at least formal leader, with only about a year and a half, 2 years formal leadership rank, but I see people every day working that wish to pass the buck, and that's the issue. This is across all agencies. People, a new guideline comes down in New Jersey, or a new policy or procedure, and they just say it doesn't apply to me. I'm not going to own that. And I think that's where organizations can start to fail without, strong leadership. These individuals, these leaders, need to understand that everything that comes down is part of the job. They must own it, and they're just as accountable as leaders that are above them. So the leadership passes throughout every different rank of that chain of command, and everybody has to own what they need to do.
So I 100% agree with you, Jason. And one of the things that if anybody's ever gone to any of our Command 1, Command 2, or a Road Sergeant tune-up, if anybody's ever gone to any of those classes, one of the things that we drive in to the minds of the people that we are training, our future leaders, our current leaders that are part of the study of leadership, is why does it occur? So why do our leaders pass the buck? Why do they not take responsibility? And to be honest, it's not their fault, because we learn from our current leaders. How do you know how to be a sergeant? We've watched the people before us. How do you know how to be a lieutenant? I've watched that person before me. We are consistently developing our next generation of leaders by what we say, what we do, how we act, how we drive, the professionalism that we display in the moment. People are learning from us. And most of our leadership skills are learned in that moment. And what are we doing? We're not changing that culture of passing the buck. So when failure occurs and there's a leader who's passing the buck, he probably learned that behavior from the people before him, and now he's perpetuating it downward. And that's one of the key things in leadership, is understanding you have to recognize that you may have been trained wrong. Accept this responsibility right now. Own everything in your world. No one else to blame. Have to acknowledge the mistakes and admit failures and take ownership of them. And if we do that right now, if you start doing that as a leader, you are changing the culture of our environment.
And there's a big professional shift that's been happening over the last at least decade. And the more I've studied leadership and the more I've taught with Command 1 and gone and now experienced students from across the country and seen these issues across the country, I can definitely wholeheartedly see that our profession as a whole is growing in a sense of making a mistake is not bad. And Jocko talks about that too. Like, you should be put into a position to fail sometimes. If there's not something that's an emergency situation, that's not life or death, if you're planning an event, or if you're doing something like for Jason as a new leader in your organization, you should be put in charge of something that's like a new project, right? And maybe though your command staff gives you input, and maybe you do something incorrectly. you're going to learn from that and you're going to grow professionally. There's nothing wrong with that. A lot of people that would get embarrassed in the past or would look at that as being a negative thing. It's not a negative thing. That ownership of your failures is how you grow as a person. It's how you grow as a leader. It's how you grow professionally and emotionally. And understanding that and accepting that is crucial for us doing the best that we can in this law enforcement environment that we live in. And the more I've studied leadership and comparing how leadership works in the military, how it works in private industry, how it works in law enforcement, we're such a blended role because this is a career. And I'm not saying that the military is not a career, but everybody that comes into law enforcement is coming into this as a 25+ year career. So you're going to make mistakes. And the earlier that you accept those mistakes in your career, the earlier that you use those as a platform for growth, the easier your career is going to be. And especially as you make that critical shift into being a supervisor, owning those failures, and more importantly, not throwing your subordinates under the bus. If you throw your subordinates under the bus, you're going to lose any credit or anything that you have with them, because they're not going to look at you as being a trustworthy person, and trying to rebuild that trust is going to be very difficult for you.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that particular thing. We talk about the cycle of positional development in our courses about how you get, first you have to develop confidence in your own abilities, and then people will start having confidence in your abilities. You need that foundation of confidence, mutual confidence in yourself and them in you, in order to start building trust between you and your people, you and your peers. And the minute you start passing the buck, the minute you start blaming someone else, they're not going to trust you, and they're not going to have confidence in you at all. So, absolutely true, Joe.
And it's the
One thing
opposite.
I would-
No, go ahead, Colin.
Go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just it actually leads right into the next points and principles here, because it's the opposite when it comes to success. Though and directly from the book, the best leaders don't just take responsibility for the job. They take extreme ownership of everything that impacts their mission. Such a leader, however, does not take credit for his team's success, but bestows that honor upon his subordinate leaders and team members. That is 100% true. And I'm sure we've all seen the people that like to take credit for the mission, that are in those leadership positions. That honor should be bestowed on the people that are actually carrying out the mission. If my team fails, I should be the face of the failure. If my team is successful, they should be in front, and I'll be there, but it's the team that succeeded in the mission. It's not me. I'm not the individual. It's that team. And that mentality has to be the mentality, especially specialized units. But in patrol, when your squad does something well, when they handle a job well, dispatchers, when you're in a pursuit, and I mean, Colin sent me an insane pursuit that these guys had, where they captured somebody that just did a shooting. That team that actually caught the people that did the shooting, that were involved in the pursuit, it wasn't just them. It was the people that were monitoring the scene, that were providing aid to the victim. It was the dispatchers that were keeping unnecessary radio traffic out there. That entire team has to be recognized. And understanding that as a leader, when you go into those types of critical incidents, and when you're dealing with those types of crazy calls that we sometimes have to deal with, that stuff and how you treat your team and how you make everybody feel successful is going to build a lot of leadership credibility for you, and it's going to make people feel great about the work that they do. That's that intrinsic motivation that we look to spark for people.
And when you moved on to this second part, right, you talk about not taking credit for the success. Some people might point out that there seems to be a dichotomy there between what's said there and what's said in the first statement, which was all responsibility for success and failure rests with the leader, right? So it's important to point out there that there's a big difference between taking responsibility for success and taking credit for success, right? As a leader, the success or failure of the mission lies with you. It's your job to ensure mission success, and where there's a failure, you own that. But when the mission is successful, you've got to give the credit for that to your people, and then a key idea there, and something that I found very useful, the idea of servant leadership, right? And so, one of the things that I learned, years ago as a sergeant in the Marine Corps, was that the word sergeant is derived from the word servant. And if you approach the job that way, that your role is to serve your subordinates, take care of them, give them the tools and equipment and training and guidance that they need to be successful and to make the mission successful, they will take care of the mission, and they'll take care of you as a leader too. But one other thing I'd like to throw out as well, what already just in these first few principles appears to me to be an underlying theme or issue, and I think we'll see this throughout, and I think it's one of the biggest issues for leadership and in our profession, and that's ego. I think that with each of these points, you can see where ego is a factor. So, recognizing, for example, that there is no one else to blame. That's tough for a lot of people. You have to really check your ego and look inward and say, how am I to blame for this failure or this situation, whatever it may be? Because a lot of times it's much easier to point the finger outward, right? And again, like giving the credit for success to your subordinates, that requires somebody who's humble and who can put their ego aside and say, no, the credit belongs with them, right? So that ego thing, I think we're gonna see that come up over and over again throughout the many parts and principles of this book.
I think that ego rolls perfectly into one of the last principles of this section. Like I said, being a younger leader, and my agency in specific, we have a whole slew of younger leaders that I'm proud to say that have developed between my tutelage and others, and really leading what the organization has done. I'll read right from this passage here. Junior leaders take charge of their smaller teams and their piece of the mission. Efficiency and effectiveness increase exponentially, and a high-performance winning team is the result. So rolling ego into that, fresh leaders, junior leaders, really haven't had time to develop ego, mainly. I think that those fresh leaders, those junior leaders, they have taken pieces from leadership in the past, supervisors, sergeants, corporals, and above, and they're piecing together strong leadership tactics between that and any other type of learning they've done outside. And they're able to come in and almost be effective in different ways. And I think that other leaders need to, outwardly and inwardly look at themselves and what those people are doing and kind of take pieces from them as well. You can learn from those junior to you as well. You don't only have to look at individuals that led before you, because there's always different styles. And those older leaders tend to have more ego because they feel more established. They feel they've been doing it for longer. But these junior leaders truly are the future, and they're starting their path towards like effective leadership without intense egos.
And to hit upon everything you guys are talking about, I think a lot has to do with understanding your role in the organization when it comes to what you're supposed to be doing. And again, it falls back to, nobody's ever explained this to people, but why, Colin was saying the responsibility of success and failure falls on the shoulders of the leader. And it absolutely does, because the leader, you're in charge of planning the operation. You're in charge of preparing your team for the operation. So the responsibility falls directly on your shoulders. As far as the team itself, they're not in charge of planning and preparation. They're in charge of the execution of the plan. So if the plan, if the operation, if whatever you're doing, if it is a success, it's not because of the planning and preparation. It's because of the execution of what was occurring. And your team is responsible for execution. They're doing it. So yes, you absolutely have to give them their credit and share that they are the ones responsible for the success. As far as the responsibility for the success and failure at the operational end, and that again, that falls directly on the leader, preparing your team, making sure they're trained properly, and in law enforcement, making sure that we're reviewing policies, that we're taking training seriously. Colin and I, we talk about this in our use of force class. What's the best way to have successful outcomes? It's through training. And a lot of times we just fumble through training. It's a necessary evil that we just try and force our way through. And our people deserve better. They deserve realistic, situational based training that's going to put them in situations that they're going to face in the real world. so that we can prepare them properly for that.
And one of the things that comes to mind with this last piece here, and listening to you guys talk, we need to recognize in our profession when we have people that are uniquely qualified or positioned to be successful in a particular role, and again, put our egos as leaders aside and allow those people to step up and perform and excel, and recognize that that's going to make the team better. It's going to contribute to success of the mission. Active shooter response is a great example of this. The most senior man responding to an incident may not be the appropriate person to step into the team leader role. If you got a guy, there's a sergeant on scene, but you got a guy that's a SWAT operator. Maybe he's a brand new cop, but before he came to your department, he was, he served in a Ranger battalion. He's got multiple combat deployments. Who should be making tactical decisions for that team? Probably the guy who's got the most tactical experience. Right. And if we can recognize that as leaders, I think we can, again, make our teams much more successful. And that, the active shooter example is just one of many. Even when you talk about operational planning and things like that, you might have somebody that's not a formal leader in your agency, but maybe they have that master's in public administration. They've got some specialized training or education that qualifies them to have a seat at the table. Hey, what do you think about this? What do you think we might want to do here? Is there something we haven't considered? And I think that's something, I know some agencies are great about that, but I think a lot of agencies could do a lot better at that.
I think that this ties directly into this whole principle right here, ties together with the ego. The more that you push the success below you and the more that you push the failures on you, it's going to make you a more humble person. And your ego will naturally be checked the more that you do that. The more that you recognize that you were the failure and your team is the reason that you succeeded. You might be the face of it at a debriefing because of the nature of your rank, but the more that you push the individual successes on the officers that were handling that scene, the more that I think that you're naturally going to become a little bit more in check. And that's a really basic incident command principle too, exactly what you just discussed, Colin. Just because you're the ranking officer responding to a scene, if you have an officer that's handling the scene well, why take over the scene? If he's done everything, gotten to the point of where the scene is now stable, if there's nothing life or death, let that person run with it. Let them develop that scene. Let them see for themselves the incident command system working. And now when they decide, now the next sergeant test is announced, they had that success on a scene. Maybe that person that wasn't considering becoming a sergeant says, you know what? I liked running that scene. I liked the way that felt. Maybe that leadership, formal leadership position now is something that I want to do. Maybe that's how we start recruiting leaders in our organizations, by letting them run those scenes and run those types of incidents. And an active shooter, especially if you have the most qualified person there and that person's not a ranking officer, let them make those decisions. And the more that we check our egos, the more that we let people do that, the better it's going to be for our profession as a whole, especially for your individual department. I think that's how we recruit future leaders, which has been an issue in my department. A lot of people aren't even interested in taking the sergeant's test because they say, the small raise isn't worth it. So how do you get that intrinsic growth? How do you get them to have that spark inside of them to say, you know what, I do want to take responsibility for officers below me. I do want to take that next step. I think that that's a powerful tool.
So
Yeah, for sure.
Can I hit on something that you just said about the you may be the face of the failure. Joe, you just said that, in a debrief, you might be the face of the failure. Absolutely true. And it's funny that you brought that up because I was just out in across the country teaching a class, and we were talking about success and failure in this specific topic. And they had a newer mid-level leader, or should I say mid-level manager in this case, mid-level manager who was in charge of a serious incident. And the incident was a debacle. So they have the after action to review what can we do to make this better. That mid-level manager didn't even show up. And they didn't show up because they knew the failures rested with them. And instead of taking, this is a teaching moment for everybody, because those who were part of the organization, they look at this individual and they're like, horrible leader. And, here you are, a newer mid-level manager, or you should be a mid-level leader. Here you are in that position. You should be trying to build the credibility. And in that moment, you could have accepted that failure and learned from it for yourself, but also did team development for everybody else within it.
It's funny because you use those words, manager and leader. It's worth taking a second to talk about that, right? A monkey could be a manager, right? And truthfully, it takes no skill to be a manager. You learn a job, you are managing people. Maybe you're managing your workforce, you're managing the people that are coming into work, making sure you're meeting your staffing. That's not leading. Management of personnel is completely different than leadership of personnel. It's funny because you just posted that video of me, and all my friends at work are all kind of making fun of me for it. But they I have a very junior officer that just texted to me. I'm like, oh no, Jim's letting you in on my secrets, my leadership secrets. But it's that one of the books that I actually broke down for you, the 5 levels of leadership. He opens up the book by saying leadership is a verb. It's not a position. Jason took a test for sergeant, right? I took a test for lieutenant. Colin took the test for lieutenant. Jim, you took tests to get all the way up to deputy chief. There's a list of people that are ready to replace us, right? What you do in that position is the act of leading, and how you execute that act of leading is what differentiates you from everybody else. This mid-level manager that you just talked about didn't even show up to this debriefing. How do you recover from that? Imagine the mountain that you have to overcome to try to recover from that. And truthfully, if he went, maybe he'd be embarrassed. Maybe he would get put into his place, but he's not getting fired. He's not losing his position, probably. Clearly not if he's still in that position and didn't even show up to it. But that's where that ego checking really comes in, right? It's like the way you lead is by bringing people with you, developing people, and moving forward. And how do you move forward if you can't get past this small hurdle? And even if it was a major failure, get past it, because now in the future, people will see that if you go into that same situation, they're going to think it's going to be a disaster all over again because you were a failure the last time. How you recover from that is more important than the failure itself.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point, by the way. And it's that's a big one for a lot of us, I think, is recognizing the difference between a manager and a leader. And I've heard it said many times that, we have a lot of managers and not a lot of real leaders. You manage resources, you manage equipment, you manage incidents, you lead people. And like you said, that's a verb. It's not what you say, it's what you do. So with that, if you guys are cool with it, I think that would be a good part to move on to the next section here.
Absolutely.
All right. So chapter 2, still in part 1 of the book here, Winning the War Within. So chapter 2 is no bad teams, only bad leaders. And that first principle, when it comes to standards, as a leader, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. No matter what has been said or written, if substandard performance is accepted and no one is held accountable, if there are no consequences, that poor performance becomes the new standard. Man, this ties directly into a lot of the stuff that you were just talking about. And it is so relatable to our profession, right? I mean, our profession is guided by SOPs and guidelines and all these policies, stacks of books of policies, right? But it's not what's written, it's not what you preach even, but what you tolerate. One of the examples in real life for me with this was as a sergeant. It starts with the roll call. And I had some people listen, I work in a fairly large city, urban area, city cops, and city cops are not generally known for being the spit and polish types. They're not generally known for when you see them out there on the corner looking, squared away with razor sharp creases and all that kind of stuff. But when I would hold a roll call, hey, there is a standard, and there are certain things that will not be tolerated. There's an expectation, and for me, those little things were important, because if you're not willing to do the little things right, how can I expect you to do the big things right? If you don't have the integrity to be accountable and do the right thing when it comes to how you show up for roll call, being on time, being prepared, being squared away, and wearing your uniform properly, then how am I going to expect that when you walk out the door, you're going to have the integrity to do the right thing when nobody's looking? The key thing with that, though, is you cannot preach that and hold people accountable to that if you're not setting the standard yourself. So
Absolutely.
as a leader, if you're gonna be that guy at roll call, then you better be the first one there. You better have the most squared away uniform. You better know what you're talking about when you stand up there and address your cops. You have to really set the bar. You cannot. One of the things that we joke about on my job is the guys that used to correct your uniform while they're standing behind a desk wearing a Yankees jersey,
Yeah, right.
or a uniform top with shorts. Like, come on, how are you going to stand there like that and call somebody out for wearing white socks, right? Like, give me a break. You have to set the standard and lead by example,
Absolutely.
especially when it comes to this principle.
And it's actually a huge block that we talk about in Command One. And now the more I've taught this class across the country, the more I've interacted with different departments, it's the differences in roll call are substantial. And I asked the question. So in New Jersey, probably the biggest overall change in my career, two things: the body camera and the use of force policy change that came out a couple of years ago. So when that came out, we all have power DMS, right? You push out use of force on power DMS. Is that training your personnel? No. Everybody's just opening up, clicking and signing it, and that's it. And if we, as a frontline supervisor, because I'm a patrol tour commander, if that's all I did to train my personnel, hey, did you guys read the new use of force policy? Great. All right, let's go out there, guys. Now, the way that we deploy OC is completely different than we did a couple of years ago. If I don't train people in that, whose fault is that? Is that the officers? Maybe. No, that's your fault. That's where we talk about the extreme ownership, the ownership of making sure that my personnel are held accountable to these new standards and who's going to train them. Yes, we have a training unit. Yes, we're going to go over that in our in-service. And my department is better than most with training. But to wait for that training would be a failure on my part. As a frontline supervisor, you have to be an expert in use of force. You have to be an expert in pursuit, whether you like it or not. It doesn't mean that you're going to be the Krav Maga or Jiu-Jitsu black belt, but you know what the principles are. You know what we need to do and what we need to know when we go out and patrol. And your officers have to be brought up to that standard. And it's done in roll call. Roll call is not a union meeting. It's not where we complain about all the failures of our department. It's not where you complain about your command staff. It's not where you complain about stuff that happened off duty. It's where you get this training done. And sometimes, especially in a busy department like yours, you might only have 10, 15 minutes. So pick out a principle a day that you want to go over with these guys. Make sure that they understand it. Make sure you have an open door policy. That's the leadership. That's where you're owning that position. That's the stuff that makes a difference. That's the stuff that's going to make people want to come to you to ask those difficult questions. Maybe they're too embarrassed in roll call to ask, when can I deploy OC? But they know you have that open door policy. Now you talked about it in a roll call, and now they actually want to come to you to have that discussion. That's how you're developing your personnel. That's how we succeed. That's how we bring people up to those standards.
Yeah. So right away, I think we're starting to see how everything that we're talking about here ties together. The further we go into the book, you're going to see that every one of these principles and ideas is interrelated with every other one, right? And so to take one little piece from chapter one, the best leaders don't just take responsibility for their job, they take extreme ownership of everything that impacts their mission, right? And how can we apply that to this principle we're looking at here, or the idea of roll call, right? You're setting the standard. You're letting people know what you will and won't tolerate. When you see an officer making a mistake, maybe it's a bad search, for example, on a car stop, right? And you should be going, man, that kid, it looks like he wasn't trained properly, or he doesn't understand the constitutional law element, that was applicable in that stop. A lot of sergeants would go, well, hey, we have a training bureau. That's not my job, right? Hey, if this is one of your officers, that they're your people, you take responsibility for that. You recognize the problem and you do something to fix it. So now you take that roll call, and yeah, you might only have 5-10 minutes. I tried to keep mine to under 10 minutes, and that was with going through the roles, giving everybody their assignments, checking their uniforms, all that kind of stuff. So at least 5 minutes was dedicated to training, and it was, hey, I saw this on a stop last night. Let's talk about that. Hey, do you understand these principles, the automobile exception to the search warrant requirement? When can you pull somebody out of the car? Do you understand that you need particularized RAS for the pat down, and the RAS for the stop may not give that, right? Like, and this is where again, the ego and the personal accountability. If you as a leader don't know this stuff, you got to push yourself to go out and get better as a leader, get better as a professional, so that you can give that guidance to your officers and you can set the standard. And lastly, looking at our role, or how we contribute to every and any failure, where you see your officers failing, it's easy to point the finger and say, man, that guy's jacked up. But are you pointing the finger at yourself and genuinely asking, what did I do or not do that contributed to that failure? Did I do everything I could to ensure that, number one, that officer was properly trained, and number two, that they were comfortable coming to me for some guidance, for some information if they needed it? It's easy to say, well, you should have asked me. Maybe there's a reason why they didn't ask you. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable, and that's your failure as a leader. So
one of the things you guys are talking about is, earlier we're talking about passing the buck, and you guys are talking about roll call and training, and the sergeants, like you were saying, Joe and Colin too. The sergeants are like, oh, well, the new policy came out that we have a training bureau to train our people, and that is in and of itself passing the buck. You can't, like Joe, you said, you can't wait for somebody else to do your job. If somebody above you didn't do a training bulletin, if somebody above you pushed it out but failed to include the training, well, then it falls on you as a leader to take that ball and run with it, so that your team is prepared. You are responsible, as we say, you're responsible for the people directly under you. You can't look around and say, well, it's their responsibility to do my job. They didn't do the job. You got to do it for your people. You can't pass the buck.
yeah,
Where I do pass the buck, though, is if I see somebody that's an expert in something, if I see somebody that just went to use of force training or just went to a case law training, I will pass the buck on them to train everybody else, including me. And that's part of checking your ego at the door too. If you have somebody
called delegate.
Yeah, right. That's another art form that we'll get into later. But like, you just had somebody studying for the sergeant test. They probably know all the AG guidelines like the back of their hand. If there's a use of force issue or a case law issue, let them come to roll call and let them discuss it. Just because you're the person standing behind the desk doesn't mean that you can't delegate or pass the buck on that type of training, so that they're taking ownership of this policy. Now they're teaching it. They're getting better prepared, because teaching something makes you more comfortable with that material. So let them do it. If they just went to a training, some specialized training, let them do it.
So I agree with that for sure. I guess I've been sitting here just looking at this word tolerance. So I know we could speak about leadership styles in a whole different podcast. There's 8 million of them, but just to broad down to 2. And I know Jocko speaks about either in this book or another one of his books. There's micromanagers and there's hands-off leaders. So I don't want to speak as to, how obviously there needs to be a blend of both of those things. But if you're so hands-off that you're just tolerating substandard work or possibly not reaching your mission to the highest extent, that's when people aren't going to respect you as a leader. They're going to see that you just seemingly don't care. That like uber tolerance is so out of the realm of what needs to happen in that instance, because the mission's not being completed, to the highest standard that's possible, or your individuals that are working underneath you are completely missing out on the knowledge that you offer and the ability that you have to lead them. I see it from agencies all across the state that I've spoken with. There's too many leaders that get to the role. Maybe they get to sergeant, they're still boots on the ground, that middle manager, but they're just that manager. They're so hands off, they feel like they've already made it. So they think that their folks underneath them are, they want to be leaders, so they're going to rise to that occasion. Well, really, they're not. They're staying low because that's the type of leadership that they're seeing. And it's sad when you see that, because they're not developing, the future of leaders or themselves, really.
The laissez-faire style. They're very hands-off.
Correct. And I'm very laissez-faire. I'm not going to lie to you. I just think leadership is certainly something that can be learned and taught, but there is a small shred of it that is an innate ability. There's some people that just don't even have the motivation to want to learn to be leaders. So those people don't have that gift. But if you've got that gift and you wish to develop it, which you really have to do both, I think you can have some laissez-faire, but you're always going to have to manage a little bit. I know manage has been that bad word while we've been talking today, but managing is part of it. If the leading is working, that's fine. Everything's, ducks in a row. But if the leadership's not working and the mission's not being, succeeded or run to the best of its ability, you're going to have to manage a little bit.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying really goes directly into the next point, which is the leader must pull the different elements within the team together to support one another, with all focused exclusively on how to best accomplish the mission. And it sounds to me like part of what you're saying, a big part of what you're saying is, where it talks about the different elements within the team, you as the leader have to recognize what those elements are. You have to know your people, know their strengths and weaknesses. You have to know the ones that want to step up into that leadership role, the ones who don't, the ones who want to be left alone, and figure out how to best bring them all together and get everybody working in the same direction, working cohesively and maximizing the effectiveness of that team. Everybody's going to be able to contribute something if you're leading them well, but you have to recognize those elements and and pull them together effectively.
That goes directly into knowing your people. If you don't know what people value, if you don't know what makes people want to come to work, that's a failure on your part. If you don't know the right person to send to these calls, that's a failure. The guy that's the very militaristic guy, that's very squared away, that will be perfect at an active shooter, he's the first person you want on that scene, may not be the person you send to a victim of a sexual assault, because maybe he doesn't have that bedside manner, or maybe he does. If you don't know that, that's a leadership failure. You have to find the round holes, get the round peg, and line them up appropriately. But if you don't know your people, and maybe you have somebody coming to your squad that's been looked at as a problem child, maybe that person has been looked at as being a negative person in your organization, there's something in law enforcement that they do well, or maybe not. But how do you know that if you don't get to know your personnel? And if you don't know your personnel, how do you even know what element? How do you pull those elements together? If you don't know some of the personal differences with people, like I said, we have 25, 30-year careers in law enforcement. Maybe people butt heads. If you don't know that and you put them as partners in a car together, whose failure is that? It's your failure as a leader. That's where we need to learn and know our personnel. That's how we can accomplish our mission. There has to be a personal element in leadership.
I'm really glad that that you brought that up. And I think that we regularly point out that law enforcement is a quasi-military profession, right? A uniformed service, if you will. There are certainly a lot of parallels, but it's important to recognize that there are some really significant differences. And when it comes to what you're talking about, Joe, I think one of the big differences and challenges is that in the military, you don't just work with your peers and subordinates. You train with them, you live with them, you are together around the clock, especially when you deploy together. But leading up to deployments, you're spending several months immersed in training where you're living together in the field. You are together around the clock, and you get to really know those people intimately. As leaders in this profession, we don't have that, so we have to make extra effort and be really deliberate about trying to get to know our people. And I think a really important part of that is, there's finally a growing movement, a shift in our profession towards resiliency and taking care of each other and recognizing some of the mental health challenges that officers face. If you don't know your people, how are you going to recognize when they're off? And are you really being a good leader if you're not able to take care of your people, if you can't recognize when they're struggling? So yeah, you've got to make the extra effort to get to know them, whether that's doing a squad dinner or getting a lunch one-on-one, rotating the squad and getting some one-on-one time with each of them over a meal and sitting down and talking to them, getting to find out about their family and things like that. It's really, really important to develop those personal relationships. And here again, there is certainly a dichotomy. We want to maintain a level of professionalism, and there is a balancing act there, and I recognize that, but you have to make that effort to get to know your people personally so that you can effectively lead them and take care of them.
Yeah, and it's funny. Well, not funny. It's honestly sad. I was listening to a different podcast, law enforcement related, and the person in this podcast was actually saying that you shouldn't socialize. You shouldn't be associated with the people that you work with. It should be kind of, you punch in, you do your job, you go home, and you kind of leave it at the door. And at the rank of officer, maybe you can do that, maybe, but you definitely can't do that if you're a leader. You definitely can't even do that if you're an informal leader. You have to have some person. And I'm not saying that these people have to be your best friend. These people don't have to come to your family gatherings. They don't have to be the people that you hang out with regularly, but you have to have some sort of personal level of understanding, because again, just going back to that simple OC example, you want there to be that open door policy, and you want them to be able to come to you with problems. And if you know that maybe this person's off, maybe this person's going through a divorce, maybe this person is having some personal issues, maybe you kind of give him an easier post for the day, if that's something as an option in your organization. Maybe you know that he has a newborn and he was up for the last 24 hours and has gotten no sleep, but doesn't want to burn time because he has so much other stuff going on in his life. Maybe you kind of leave him inside for the day, if that's an option in your department, because again, you know your personnel, and you know that they know that they can actually come to you with this type of stuff. If they don't think that they can come to you, maybe you put this guy out on the road and maybe he crashes because he's so overtired. In his mind, he's doing the right thing by coming to work, but he's not doing a service to anybody. There has to be a personal element. We have to understand what our people are going through in their personal lives so that we can kind of cater to them, and letting them know that you're there for them. It goes a long way.
I agree completely with everything you guys have said. I mean, certainly breaking bread, getting a meal is one of the best things you can do. I know I try with every squad that I've had, whether I was a supervisor or a regular rank and file officer. Going to a meal was huge, and understanding that little bit of personal, mentality of meeting the family, meeting a spouse, meeting their children, whatever you can do. But the biggest thing I think, Joe, that you just said is, in our profession specifically, you can't just be a coworker. I think that's a little bit of a lost side that we're seeing. And we can, go into the whole, the blue brotherhood and the thin blue line. That's a different conversation. But there's the level of coworker or acquaintance. There's a friend. You have to certainly be at least somewhere in the middle here in this job. Mm-hmm. You have to have at least a heightened care for that individual that's working for you or alongside you, because we do different work. We don't just, we don't work in retail. We don't work in the service industry. Sure, we serve, but we don't work in like the traditional service industry. We do odd things for this, this world. We work differently. So you have to know people differently. You have to know them more, definitely. You have to see them, understand what their strengths and weaknesses are, and be able to lift them up and help them in their times of need.
Yep. I think the key to what you're talking about, because you're spot on. The things that we do and the things that we expect of another in this profession require a tremendous amount of trust. I when I go to work with you, I have to trust you with my life. And you're not going to build that level of trust with acquaintances. You're not going to build that level of trust with people that you don't have relationships with. So yeah, you're spot on with that. It's a really important factor. And one other thing I'd like to throw out with this bullet point before we move on to the last one is we're talking about meals, right? There's another great book out there by a guy named Simon Sinek, who's phenomenal in the leadership sphere. He's got a ton of stuff available on YouTube. But he spent some time with the Marine Corps and studying leadership with them and their style of leadership. And he wrote a book called Leaders Eat Last. And it's a very, very simple principle that, obviously he was able to, write a whole book about. So he did a deep dive on it. But the principle is simple. And it's basically when you watch a group of Marines sit down if it's out in the field, right? The leaders in that group are going to be the last ones to eat. Many times you're going to watch them actually, not only are they the last, but they're going to get up and they're going to serve their junior Marines. And the most junior Marine in that group is always going to be the first one in line for chow. And everybody falls in by seniority behind him. The idea there is that we're taking care of our subordinates. Again, that idea of servant leadership, right? Your number one responsibility as a leader is to your people and to take care of your people, to look out for their well-being, make sure that they're provided for. And that means everything from their equipment, to their training, to their chow. And if there's not enough food, guess what? That leader's going to go hungry, not that junior Marine. Right. So I've always loved that. I think it's a great illustration of a style of leadership again, a very simple idea, but man, it can have a huge impact. And if you want to, if you're looking for a simple way to build those relationships with your subordinates and show them that you care about them, throw together a barbecue and you man the grill and you serve your people and you make sure that most junior officer is the first one to get served. Man, what an impact that's going to have on them and their impression of you as a leader.
And as a leader, we shouldn't be needing to point to our rank to get our mission accomplished, right? And that's how you build your leadership. That's how you build your trust. And I'll never forget, and he's since retired, and I would love to have a conversation with him about this now that he's retired. He was a lieutenant at the time, and I don't even remember what my question was about. But I remember I asked, why do I have to do X, Y, and Z? And he said, I have 2 reasons that you had to do it. And he pointed to his collars, 1 and 2. Now go and do it. Okay, you got that. You got the position. You're a lieutenant. I was an officer at the time. And he got it done. But there's a million other ways that you could have done that. And sometimes, like for our department, we use a lot of directed patrols. Our directed patrols are driven by comp stat. If there's an uptick in thefts, assaults, robberies, we're going to focus our efforts on that area. So I don't even remember what the question was, honestly. But sometimes just saying, hey, we've had 4 thefts on your days off at this station. That's why I need you to patrol this area for the foreseeable future, because we want to identify the people involved in these thefts. That's sometimes that one very quick exchange would have been enough to make me take ownership and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to go do that because I do want to catch this guy that's doing thefts. We shouldn't have to point to our collar brass or our stripes on our sleeve to be able to get the mission accomplished. And exactly what you said, Colin, how you do that is by building rapport, building trust. Because now in the squad that I work with, and I hope that they're listening to this, like when I ask them to do something, they don't really ask why, because they know if I'm telling them to do something, I'm usually giving them the explanation when I can. And if I'm asking them to do something that's maybe not the most glamorous post or not the most glamorous thing, they know that they're doing it because they have to, and I'm asking them. So how you get that rapport with people is by getting that trust. Have a meal with them, get to know their family, because that stuff goes such a long way. They're going to be willing to do the undesirable, because there's a lot of undesirable stuff in our profession.
It's really funny to bring this up. So the same guy that wrote Leaders Eat Last did another book called Starting with Why. And the importance of making sure that you ensure that your people understand the why behind what it is that they're doing, right? And Jocko talks about this a lot in the book. So,
Yep.
If one of your junior people fails at something, they make a mistake, did you ensure that they really truly understood what it was that you were asking of them, and that they understood how they were to do it and why? Now, obviously, that there's a balance here. There's a time and a place for that. If we're about to go through a door, that's not the time for you to stop and say why. But if you've built some leadership capital, if you have those good, strong relationships and they trust you, they're not going to be asking you why. They're going to follow you, right? They're going to do that, hopefully flinchingly, unhesitatingly, because they trust you, right? But you may be asking somebody to do something and they genuinely don't understand the task at hand. It is your job as a leader to make sure that they understand that, right? And that if your answer is flicking the collars, man, you are failing miserably as a leader.
Yeah,
Well,
100%.
a lot of that has to do with like I go back to what I said right in the very beginning. That was a learned behavior from the leaders before them. The leaders before them, they didn't give a reason. It was keep your mouth shut, do what I tell you to do. Then the next generation said, well, I don't want to be like that. So, but they learn those behaviors, and well, we could talk all day about those learned behaviors and how the generations that followed those try to change it. I wanted to know why, and I wasn't told. So when I became a leader and I was giving a task, I made sure I included the why in it so that my people knew, because that's what I wanted. So
The
every
millennials were
generation,
the millennials are Generation Y because they're always asking why, right?
I was well, the fact that you said I was a millennial, that's pretty good, because I'm
I love basketball. I'll tell you, it's a shame. It's a great stereotype.
Well, I
that
think
brings us into
you-
this last point here. This leader should never be satisfied. We must always try to improve, identifying weaknesses. Good leaders seek to strengthen them, come up with a plan to overcome the challenges. And that's kind of falling right into what we're saying is we saw things that have happened in the past, and we're identifying those weaknesses of the leaders that came before us, and we're seeking to strengthen and overcome the challenges that I've faced moving forward.
I think one of the things that we would all agree on is the frustration when you ask somebody why we're doing things a certain way, and they tell you, well, that's how we've always done it. Everybody in our profession has heard that at some point or another. And man, that is not a good answer. And I like where you started today with, mention of how we're trying to change the culture. Well, we've always done it that way, or that's how my sergeant did it. If you're going to hold yourself accountable, you can do better. You can look for a better way to approach that. But one practical tool that I'd like to share that I find to be helpful when it comes to this subject in particular, and never being satisfied. I believe wholeheartedly in the concept of positive dissatisfaction. And that is to say, every achievement in your career, every stride in personal growth and professional development, all that stuff, certainly take a moment to appreciate that, be proud, be grateful, whatever. But then move on and look for the next obstacle, the next challenge, the next goal, and be deliberate about that. And so one of the things that I do for myself and for my guys, guys in my squad, we have a board up in the office, and on that board, there's 3 categories: short-term goals, mid-range goals, and long-term goals. And we're constantly updating that. So we have our waypoints. We have, some direction that we're deliberately moving towards in order to improve every day. So, what are we striving for in the near term? What things do we got to get done to accomplish the mission today, tomorrow, this week? What boxes am I checking for my personal and professional development this week, this month? And then looking down the road, what do we want to get done? What do we want to achieve in the next 6 months and then in the next year, for example. And that might be things like attending a certain school, getting a degree, getting moved up in rank, whatever the case. So long as you're setting those goals for yourself and your subordinates, and you're deliberately working towards that and helping them to work towards that, helping them to achieve that development, I think that's a very helpful tool.
It's especially important with the younger officers, letting them see earlier in their career how important it is to recognize this as a marathon, right? The marathon of this career, the development that you're going to undergo for the next 25, 30 years. How are you going to get to the end goal of retirement? How are you going to be like Jim over here, enjoying every minute of retirement, right? Like you don't get there just by punching in and punching out over the next 25 years. You have to purposely set your own professional goals, develop yourself, and work towards those goals. And us as frontline supervisor, as a leader in these formal positions, that's part of the ownership, and that's part of getting to know your people, understanding where do you want to go in your career. And being a patrol officer for 25, 30 years, that's okay. But you're going to be the best patrol officer you can be. You're going to be an expert at handling the calls that your agency handles. You're going to be the community person because you're going to know your community over the next 25, 30 years. So helping that person, and even if they say, I don't ever want to be promoted, I just want to be in patrol for the rest of my career and left alone, that's fine. But you're still going to be the best patrol officer that you can be. I want to make sure that you're the best officer. That's where we take that ownership.
All right, now let's on that note, let's bring it to an end. We've been going for quite a while. We went through the first couple chapters of the book, and we'll pick up on the next part of this series with chapter 3, Believe. And I just want to thank you guys for taking time and discussing this book. And if you are out there listening to us, keep in mind that we do talk about real life, real world, situational based application of these principles in all of our leadership classes that we hold throughout the country. So I look forward to having you and seeing you in class. And with that, we'll call it to an end. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, guys.
This podcast is brought to you by the J. Harris Academy of Police Training. J. Harris Academy of Police Training is based in New Jersey and provides law enforcement training services nationwide for promotional examinations, use of force, supervisory development, and other key areas within law enforcement. This podcast is utilized to discuss key topics occurring within the profession. The opinions and information provided is for entertainment purposes only. In an effort to provide this, we often purposely discuss opposite views and opinions to spark conversation and develop discussion points. The contents of the show and show notes are all copyrighted. All blog posts, podcasts, and show notes that are distributed to the public for free can be redistributed via hard copy or electronic copy for free only if the J. Harris Academy of Police Training is included as the acknowledged author within the actual media that is redistributed. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog. Under no circumstances shall the J. Harris Academy of Police Training, any guests, contributors to the podcast or blog, or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the company be responsible for damages arising from the use of the information provided.